Well, things in Syria seem to be heating up under the American people's nose. Of course, the American people never really paid much attention to the war in Syria, and frankly, they shouldn't, because you would think that a civil war in a far-off Middle East country, really should be no concern of the average American unless they happen to have family in Syria. But unfortunately, it is the case that our government has been intimately involved with the conflict there from the very beginning. And many had hoped, those few Americans who actually are aware that the U.S. is involved in Syria were hopeful that, once President Trump got elected, since he ran on, pulling the troops out of Syria, that would happen, and that the U.S. involvement would be done there, and the Civil War would go on and hopefully end at some point, but either way, it would be, with or without the U.S.'s involvement. Then, of course, that kept getting delayed and delayed until finally, President Trump announces that he's going to withdraw the troops from northern Syria, and that the Turks are going to move in to fill that void. And of course, the U.S. troops didn't really leave Syria. They just moved to a different part of Syria, and now they've been, sitting occupying the oil fields in eastern Syria for, a few months now. And Turkey has been running wild in the north of the country, all along their border with Syria, which again, hey, do I think that Turkey should be involved there either? But, but I'm not too passionate about it since, Turkey's not my government. I'm much less concerned about what the Turks are doing, especially since, Turkey does share a border with Syria, so they do have, legitimate national security concerns there. If there's the country next door to them is embroiled in a decade-long civil war. And so the Turks have been, injecting these guys who, were Syrian refugees in Turkey who were sitting in those camps for so many years, many of whom, are in fact jihadists, injecting them back into Syria and turning them loose against the Assad government, trying to stop it, at all costs, Assad from consolidating, the last bits of the country that he doesn't, control at this point. And so other than those Kurdish areas in the northeast of Syria, which Turkey invaded, a few months ago, the last big place to where there's really any real civil war to speak of is the Idlib province. This is the last readout of all those various jihadist groups who were fighting against Assad for so many years. And the Turks have done everything in their power to make sure that, Idlib hasn't fallen. Of course, I don't believe that the Turks have sent actual ground troops into Idlib to try and support it, because I don't think that they haven't at any point gotten into direct conflicts with the Syrian Arab army, to my knowledge. But in the past week or so, things seem to have been escalating in terms of the rhetoric, and the Turks seem like they're much more open to fighting a direct war against Assad. Which a few years ago, certainly, during the Obama years and the early Trump years, in which, there was a very strong push in the West for, Assad must go. I think that the Turks might have found quite a bit of support from the media and from the general political establishment in the Western countries, everywhere from Germany, Britain, and the U.S. For taking on Assad's government directly. But at this point, I don't see, who the constituency is for such an operation. I don't see why anyone really would be that interested at this point. I mean, it seems to me pretty obvious that Assad is not going to go. And that, he can't simply be destabilized just by pumping in, more weapons into the country to try and create more unrest. It seems like the only thing that really would topple the Assad regime at this point is a full-scale normal invasion, like you would, like honest empires used to do. It was pretty clear that, hey, there's this government that we don't like, so we're going to invade and topple them and conquer them and impose our own rule there. That used to be the way the game was played. And so, sure, if you did that, yeah, you could topple Assad, but, that there's a lot of costs involved with that, and I don't feel like, there's enough anti-Assad, people in the world who are, in the mood to really, incur that much costs. Nevertheless, the Turks seem to be trying to egg the Americans on and get them to, support whatever it is they plan on doing in Syria, whatever this full-scale war is. And they seem kind of confident, I guess from what I've been reading, that the U.S. Will in fact assist them. Of course, the Western media still is pretty strong on the point that this whole Idlib thing is a David and Goliath kind of narrative, that where you've got these poor little people in Idlib who are just suffering under the Assad's impending invasion of their happy little city. It's kind of like the way that you read about the siege of Madrid during the Spanish Civil War. Well, the siege of Idlib has lasted many years as well, and it is kind of the last rebel stronghold. And to keep Idlib from falling eventually, I think that it would take more than just U.S. weapons. I think what Turkey's asking for is actually the U.S. to impose some kind of a no-fly zone. Which of course means directly taking on not only Syria but also Russia, because Russia's operating in this sphere. They're operating around Idlib. They are openly collaborating with their ally, the government in Damascus, and so imposing that sort of those sorts of restrictions, essentially threatening to shoot down Russian warplanes. That's a pretty big escalation, and it's something that I just don't see the U.S. doing at this point in Syria. I think it makes much more sense for the U.S. to try and break off eastern Syria and just sort of keep the oil, and let what happens in the west of the country, which is relatively poor in terms of natural resources, just sort of let them do whatever they want. A lot of folks, though, who are, again, these, anonymous source types of people who sort of permeate these news stories, they make it sound like the U.S. is pretty open to doing something to help Turkey, like the U.S. is on board with them. But I don't see it. I don't know if this is, just propaganda, if this is posturing, what exactly the end game is. Or perhaps I'm thinking too hard to try and make sense out of this, because, American foreign policy over the last, since the end of the Cold War, really, has been fairly incoherent. The U.S. lost its raison d'etre, with the fall of the Soviet Union, and I don't think that they've ever really gotten it back. They haven't found out who their next big enemy is, because that's really how the U.S. defined itself since 1945. And let's be clear, people like to think that America began in 1776, and that's where we trace our roots back to, and that's just not the case. Modern American society began in 1945. World War II is our creation myth. It's far more important than the American Revolution in defining what this country stands for today. What our government stands for, what Washington is. It all was decided, as a result of World War II. And after that war, the U.S. defined itself as the anti-Soviet power in the world. And since the Soviets went away, they just I don't know where our government is headed. They've tried to find all these new boogeymen, and they go back and forth. Are we going to be mad at the Shiites, or are we going to be mad at the Sunnis? We've had two redirections when it comes to the Mideast policy in the U.S. Flip-flopping essentially. And so the U.S. has flip-flopped back and forth so many times, I don't necessarily know where we're at right now. So I mean, perhaps I'm asking too much to assume that the government is acting rationally, and would see that after this 10-year-long civil war almost, Assad's not gone, and so it's kind of a waste of time to try and depose him now. Perhaps they just don't see it that way. Either way, I'm going to have to wait for more details to see what happens as far as this is concerned, because the Idlib thing it's a ticking time bomb. Idlib has been under siege for a long time, and something's going to happen there eventually. Either Idlib will fall and will be allowed to fall, or some outside influence like Turkey is going to come in and try and stave off the fall of the city for as long as possible, and get involved in a direct conflict with Syria and Russia. And that, of course, would lead to a much bigger war. It would turn a civil war into an interstate war. So with that said, if you gain anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.